Okay, so for part 2 of our rendering a gradation, we'll get to actually laying in markers. So like I was saying in our class meeting, you're going to start with your blender, clear blender, and you'll notice right away that a little bit of that graphite wants to blend in with a marker. We're not going to worry about that. Really, our goal is just to get comfortable making smooth blends with the markers. And as I mentioned, you really start with your lightest tone, usually with markers. Transparent media, you want to go light to dark. And I'm going to blend all the way across. I'm going to slow down my strokes too, so we're not thinking about sketching, and fill every part of this paper. And you can see there's a little color shift there where it's wet. So what we're going to do now is switch to 10. And that happens to be a brush style, which is fine. We can blend with that. And I'm going to start from the right end of 10 and blend towards 0. And I'm then going, once you see I have this nice area of fairly flat tone, I'm going to push to the right and take it all the way through 30. And that's about the speed you're going to want to use. So now I'm going to switch to 20. Got about a 2-minute window, I would say, really, to keep going with the markers before they start to set into the paper. And you notice I started with my 20 on the edge of 30 and 40. I'm now going to blend back. And I'm going to stop right about there. And I'm going to go back to my blender. And you see how I had an edge forming? I'm going to stop that and blend that 20, pushing that pigment around until I get a little bit away from, and I'm lifting my paper so you can see that there is a little bit of puddling going on underneath. Just so I can see this more clearly, I'm going to move my paper. This will be an issue when you're really flooding the paper with a lot of marker. But you can see now, I can clearly see I've got a little step there. So, fine tip. So I switched to the fine tip just to drop in a little bit of tone. This is the magic of this paper. I just drop that tone in and it blends for me. Love that. Then just a little bit of 10. So I'm working 3 tones. I'm working blender, which is 0, 10, which is 10, and 20 together. And I can push and pull this tone. I can push it a little darker, which I'm doing, because this is our 20% zone. And now I'm going to push forward again, because I want to get the paper wet for the next 2 sections. And I'm going to go into 40. Now you see right there the paper has started to dry. So I get a step. That means it's time to actually switch to our next marker. Hopefully that will be a 30. Hunting around for it. And there we go. Okay. Actually, my 30, I bought a new 30, and I believe I still have it upstairs. So what I'm going to do is improvise. I'm actually going to show you how to jump a tone. This is actually a 50. And now go back into the white tip of the marker and slow down. So that is a 50 tone there. And you can see, actually it's a 40, so I lied. It's a 40. What I skipped was 30. I'm doing that specifically because I can't put my hands on a 30. So what do? You improvise and you come up with a quick solution, which is to blend across to get the 30 between 40 and 20. So what I'm doing now is taking my 20. And you can see right there, that's not bad. And I keep lifting that paper so I can see how much is going to be a little bit of staining underneath. Move it around again, and that reveals that I do have a step there. I want to get rid of that step, so I take that 20 again. You can see just by doing a little bit of rewetting of the paper, it's already taking some of that tone away. Now I'm going to go to a 50 and drop in just a slight bit of tone and push that with a 20, and then continue on my merry way. So far, so good. I do have a dark area. That's specifically because I missed a tone, so I was improvising. But I'm going to continue on just to give you an idea of how this works. So now 50 again. I'm going to bring that tone right up to the edge of that jump in value. And you know, I'm not worrying too much about the outer edge of my box. It doesn't have to be clean and crisp. Another thing I will mention is taping off an area does not work with markers. Unlike with watercolors, you can't tape off marker to create clean edges. It literally goes underneath the paper anyway, absorbs into the paper. And so now I'm going into 70. If you've noticed, I'm actually just using a 50, and I'm really just laying the basis for the remainder of my tones. Now, there's different strategies. You can do a gradation in a lot of different ways. I could do it tone by tone and just keep progressing across. But what I'm doing is I jumped way ahead to almost to 90 here, really 290. And at this point, I'm going to introduce 60. And right in the 70 range, I'm going to start coming back towards that next jump in tone. And then I'm going to pull across what I already laid down as 50 and start pulling that across. The reason I do this, I keep pulling farther ahead, is I don't want a heavy line or edge forming. So what I'm doing is pulling the stone all the way across. So I've made it all the way to what is going to be 100. And you see no real change here, but that's a good base tone for me to work with now. So this is a 40 again. Believe it or not, that looks really dark for a 40. Actually, I won't use that. You'll find that the labeling on these markers can be a little bit deceptive, so you always have to check your percentages. This is a 70. That's what I was hunting for. And there's the difference up there. You can see just how much of a difference there is. And if I look here, remember I said you might want to do swatches. That's actually 70 over 80. So if I put that there and then double up, when you double layer a marker, you will get about a 5% deepening of tone. So that's about a 75 now. I'm thinking that what I'll do, since I have 50 down already, I'm not going to use 80 at this point. I'm just going to take this 70, pull it all the way across. There's my edge right now. That's a drying edge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feather that. Believe it or not, I jump back to 20. I'm now using 20 as a blender. It's very common for me when I'm in these dark tones. 20 or 30 is typically what I'm going to go to for a blender. When I say blender at this point, it's just a very light, well, much lighter tone, like 4 or 5 steps lighter. It doesn't darken too much, because the great danger is, well, you can see it happening a little here. I'm getting a dark halo. I don't want to add too much tone every time I try to smooth. This is actually a 40 to try to obscure that. And my paper's getting a little shiny, and you can see the reason why. It's puddling underneath. Time for another move. Yeah, let's find a clean spot. And you can see where the problems are. You see I have a light area, I have a darkening area. This is going to be okay because I need to get darker anyway as I progress. So I'm going to come back from the darkest end and approach that dark area. So I didn't start here, I started over here. And just like I was explaining on the geometric shapes, start from the core shadow. Once you've basically laid in the blender in the lightest tones, go right to the core shadow, work your way out from the core shadow, and keep blending edges. So now I just jump back to a 40 again to get rid of a little bit of an edge that was forming there. And drop a little more tone in here. So I'm effectively using my 40 as a blender at this point. So you can see that I keep downshifting and then shifting back up, downshifting to the color I want or the tone, and then shifting up to a much lighter marker to use it as a blender. Now the blender is 40 and I'm working on 80. So last but not least, we're going to go to 90, which is going to give us something close to 100 without ever using that 100% marker, which comes in your pack of, I believe it's 11 markers or 12. That 100% is just so overpowering, you don't need to use it most of the time. And it has a huge red content in the pigment, so it looks very different from everything else. There are some cases where you want to use it. That's actually my destination tone right there. That's going to dry where I want it. So what I'm going to do is go back into these middle areas and see if I can't resolve some jumps in tone that I'm seeing. And not have my markers drop all over the floor, which they love to do. So right here, this paper is still a bit wet. I dropped in a little tone there and a little tone there. That was actually a 20. Now, amazingly, I'm going back to my blender because at this point, I'm really doing some minor tweaking of tone. And I don't want anything to darken more than it is. I just want to smooth if I can. So I'm taking that blender and re-wetting, going all the way up to here. So basically wetting this middle area of the paper. Pretty good there, but I'm going to move the paper one more time. Let's see. It's time to reposition. Now, you can see my problem areas. I got a little bit of a dark area. I'm going to disguise that. And I'm using the fine tip just so I don't put down too much tone. The paper is still wet because I use that blender, so it's smoothing out. That's actually working pretty well. In this light area here, which is right here, I'm going to wet that area, try to disguise some of this halo of dark tone, and I'm actually going to blend out with this 10. So this is now an example of going back into your marker, which is partially dry, and reworking it. Little areas where I want to darken, I'm just taking this 20 and just tickling in a little bit of color. And that little bit of blue is probably a fragment, a little bit of color pencil I had sitting somewhere, and it got into the mix. That's okay. So at this stage, these geometric shapes, we're not using color pencil. Specifically, I want you to just use the markers to get the best tones you can. So we're not lightening anything specifically. We can pull a little bit of pigment out of the markers by doing what I was doing. I can bleach a little pigment out, but it gets a little bit messy. Basically, what I'm really doing is I'm disguising areas in my transition that maybe got dark a little bit too fast. So I'm looking at this area right here. I'm going to switch back to the wide tip of the marker. And I need a kind of an intermediate tone, a mid-tone like a 50, to just drop in a little bit more pigment on both sides of that. You can see right there it's dry, so it's showing me my marks. If you see marks actually show, it means that area of the paper is dried. But you can quickly go in and just take either a 10 or a blender and lighten it, or rather wet that area down. So roughly, this is an okay gradation. It's not perfect, but it does give me all the tones. And so there's a bit of streakiness still in it, but that gives you an idea of the working back and forth. That's probably about where you're going to be on your first gradation. We can fine tune these. What I would do now is I'd probably let this dry, and then I would go back into it and do another. I'd actually rather have you just let it dry, leave it, and start a fresh blend. set up your segments and everything, and just start again and see if you can't do a cleaner blend on the second time around. And we'll stop right there for this, and I may actually show a little bit more of this, or I may show you the cube. I'll probably transition to the cube next.